The continued story of Taran, the assistant pigkeeper. I'm glad you've stayed to listen. Now sit round, as Papa Bear reads a story. Chapter 4. A Matter of Cows. Late that afternoon, the companions sighted the crimson banner of the House of Smoit, its black bear emblem flying bravely above the towers of Caircadarn. Unlike the palisaded strongholds of the Cantref lords, Smoit's castle was a fortress, with walls of hewn stone and iron-studded gates thick enough to withstand all attack. The chips in the stones and the dents in the portal told Taran that the castle had indeed thrown back not a few assaults. For the three travelers, however, the gates were flung open willingly, and an honor guard of spearmen hastened to escort the companions. The red-bearded king sat at the dining table in his great hall, and from the array of dishes, platters, and drinking horns, both full and empty, Taran judged Smoit could scarcely have left off eating since morning. Seeing the companions, the king leaped from his throne of oak wood, fashioned in the shape of a gigantic bear, looking much like Smoit himself. "My body and bones!" Smoit roared, so loudly that dishes rattled on the table. "It's better than a feast to see all of you!" His battle-scarred face beamed with delight, and he flung his burly arms around the companions in a joint-cracking hug. "Scrape out a tune from that old pot of yours," he cried to Fluter. "A merry tune, for a merry meeting. And you, my lad," he went on, seizing Taran's shoulders with his heavy, red-furred hands. "When last we met, you looked scrawny as a plucked chicken. And your shaggy friend, what, has he rolled in the bushes all the way from Caerdalban?" Smoit clapped his hands, shouted for more food and drink, and would hear nothing of Taran's news until the companions had eaten, and the companion had downed another full meal. "The Mirror of Lunette?" said Smoit when Taran at last was able to tell his quest. "I've heard of no such thing. As well seek a needle in a haystack as a looking-glass in the Logardarn Mountains." The king's heavy brow furrowed, and he shook his head. "The Logardarns rise in the land of the Free Comets, and whether the folk there will be of a mind to help you—" "The Free Comets?" Taran asked. "I've heard them named, but know little else about them." "They're hamlets and small villages," Fluter put in. "They start to the east of the hill cantrevs and spread as far as Great Avron. I've never journeyed there myself. The Free Comets are a bit far, even for my ramblings. But the land itself is the pleasantest in Prydain. Fair hills and dales, rich soil to farm, sweet grass for grazing. There's iron for good blades, gold and silver for fine ornaments. Enlaw Clayshaper is said to dwell among the comet folk, as do many other craftsmen, master weavers, metalsmiths. From time out of mind, their skills have been the comet's pride." "A proud folk they are," said Smoit, "and a stiff-necked breed. They bow to no Cantrev lords, but only to the High King Math himself." "No Cantrev lords?" asked Taran, puzzled. "Who then rules them?" "Why, they rule themselves," answered Smoit. "Strong and steadfast they are, too, and by my beard, I'm sure there's more peace and neighborliness in the Free Comets than anywhere else in Prydain. And so what need have they for kings or lords? When you come to the meat of it," he added, "a king's strength lies in the will of those he rules." Taran had been listening closely to these words of Smoit, nodded his head. "I had not thought of it thus," he said, half to himself. "Indeed, true allegiance is only willingly given." "Enough talk," cried Smoit. "It hurts my head and dries my gullet. Let's have more meat and drink. Forget the mirror. Tarry with me and my Cantrev lad. We'll ride to the hunt, feast, and make you merry. You'll put more flesh on your bones here than scrambling about on a fool's errand. And that, my boy, is good counsel to you." Nevertheless, when he finally saw that Taran would not be dissuaded, Smoit good-naturedly agreed to give the companions all they needed for the journey. Next morning, after a huge breakfast, which Smoit declared would serve to whet their appetites for dinner, the king threw open his storehouse to them and went with them to be sure they chose the best of gear. Taran had only begun sorting through coils of ropes, saddlebags, and harness leather when one of the castle guards burst into the storeroom, calling, "Sire, a horseman from Lord Gast has come. Raiders from Lord Gorion's stronghold have stolen Gast's prize cow and the rest of the herd with her." "My pulse!" roared Smoit. My breath and blood! The king's tangled bush of eyebrows nodded, and his face turned as red as his beard. How does he dare stir trouble in my cantrev? The men of Gast have armed. They ride against Gorion, the guard hastened on. Gast craves your help. Will you speak to his messenger? Speak to him, bellowed Smoit. I'll clap his master in irons for breaking the peace, and worse, for breaking it without my leave. Put Gast in irons? Taran asked with some perplexity. But Gorion stole his cow. His cow? Cried Smoit. His cow indeed. Gast stole her from Gorion himself last year, and before that the other way around. Neither of them knows whose beast it is rightly. Those two brawlers have ever been at loggerheads. Now the warm weather heats their blood again, but I'll cool their tempers in my dungeon. Gast and Gorion both. Smoit snatched up a mighty, double-edged battle-axe. I'll fetch them back by the ears, he roared. They know my dungeons. They've been there often enough. Who rides with me? I will, cried Fluter, his eyes lighting up. Great Beelin of Phlegm never shuns a fight. If you ask our help, sire, Taran began, we give it willingly, but... Mount up then, lad, shouted Smoit. You'll see justice done, and I'll have peace between Gast and Gorion if I have to break their heads to gain it. Swinging his battle-axe, Smoit bolted from the storeroom, bellowing orders right and left. A dozen warriors sprang to horse. Smoit leaped astride a tall, barrel-chested steed, whistled through his teeth almost loudly enough to break them, and waved his men onward. Amid the shouting and confusion, Taran, bewildered, found himself atop Melonless, galloping across the courtyard and out the castle gate. The red-bearded king set such a pace through the valleys that it put even Lion on her mettle to keep up, while Gurgi, with most of the wind pounded out of him, clung to the neck of his frantically galloping pony. Smoit's warhorse was in a lather, and so was Melonless before the Cantrip King signaled a halt. To meet! Smoit cried, swinging out of the saddle and looking as unwearied as if he had begun a morning's trot. The companions, still catching their breath, had by no means found their appetites, but Smoit clapped his hands to the heavy bronze belt around his middle. Hunger makes a man gloomy, and saps all the spirit from a battle. Sire, must we battle with Lord Gast? Taran asked with some concern, for Smoit's warband numbered only the dozen who had ridden from Caircadarn. And if Lord Gorion's men have armed, we may be too few to stand against all of them. Battle? Smoit retorted. No, more's the pity. I'll have those troublemakers by the nose and into my dungeons before nightfall. They'll do as I command. I'm their king by my beard. There's brawn enough here, he added, shaking a mighty fist, to make them remember it. And yet, Taran ventured to say, you yourself told me a king's true strength lay in the will of those he ruled. How's that? Cried Smoit, who had settled his bulk against a tree trunk and was about to attack the joint of meat he had pulled from his saddlebag. Don't puzzle me with my own words. My body and bones. A king is a king. I meant only that you've locked Gast and Gorion in your dungeon many times before, Taran answered, and still they quarrel. Is there no way to keep peace between them, or make them understand? I'll reason them reasons, bellowed Smoit, clutching his battle-axe. He knitted his jutting brows. But true enough it is, he admitted, frowning and seeming to chew at the thought as if it were gristle in his meat. They go surly to the dungeon, and surly leave it. You've struck on something, my lad. The dungeon's useless against that pair. And my pulse, I know why. It needs more dampness, more draught. So be it, I'll have the place well watered down tonight. Taran was about to remark that his own thought was otherwise, but Fluter called out and pointed to a horseman galloping across the meadow. He wears the colors of Gorion, shouted Smoit, jumping to his feet, still holding the joint in one hand and the battle-axe in the other. Two of the warriors quickly mounted, and, drawing swords, spurred to engage the rider. But the horseman, brandishing his weapon hilt downward, cried out that he bore tidings from the Cantrip Lord. You rogue, Smoit bellowed, dropping both meat and axe, and collaring the rider to haul him bodily from the saddle. What other mischief's afoot? Speak, give me your news, man, or I'll have it out of you along with your gizzard. Sire, gasped the messenger, Lord Gast attacks in strength. My lord Gorion is hard-pressed. He has ordered more of his warriors to arms, and calls on you to help him as well. What of the cows? Cried Smoit. Has Gast won them back? Does Gorion still hold them? Neither, sire, answered the messenger as well he could, with Smoit shaking him between every word. Lord Gast attacked Lord Gorion to regain his own herd and take Gorion's too. But as they fought, all the beasts frightened and ran off. The cows? Sire, both herds are gone, lost, every soul of them, and Cornelio herself. Let that be the end of it, declared Smoit, and a good lesson for all cow robbers. Gast and Gorion shall cry peace, and I'll spare them in my dungeon. Sire, the fighting grows hotter, the messenger said urgently. Neither one will leave off. Each blames the other for loss of his herd. Lord Gorion swears vengeance on Lord Gast, and Lord Gast swears vengeance on Lord Gorion. They've been itching for battle, both of them. Smoit burst out. Now they find their excuse. He summoned one of his warriors, ordering him to take Gorion's messenger to Caer-Cadaern, there to be held as hostage. To horse, the rest of you, Smoit commanded. My body and bones will see sport after all. He gripped his axe. Oh, there'll be heads broken today, he cried with relish, and his battered face brightened as if he were on his way to a feast. The bards will sing of this, exclaimed Fluter, carried away by Smoit's ardor. A flam in the thick of battle. The thicker, the better. The harp shuddered, and a string snapped in two. I mean, Fluter hastily added, I hope we're not too badly outnumbered. Sire, Taran called as Smoit strode to his warhorse. If Gast and Gorion won't stop because their herds are lost, shouldn't we try to find the cows? Yes, yes, Gurgi put in. Find cows gone with strayings, and put an end to fighting and smitings. But Smoit had already mounted, and was shouting for the warband to follow, and Taran could do no more than gallop after him, to which stronghold Smoit was leading them, Taran did not know. As far as Smoit was concerned, Taran decided, it made little difference whether Gast or Gorion fell first into the king's hands. In a while, however, Taran recognized the path he and Gurgi had taken from Aiden's farm, and he judged now that Smoit would make for Gorion's stronghold. But as they pounded across an open field, the king veered sharply, and Taran glimpsed a troop of mounted warriors some distance away. At the sight of their banners, Smoit bellowed furiously and spurred his steed to overtake the horsemen. But the riders, themselves galloping at top speed, quickly vanished into the woodland. Smoit reined up, shouting after them and shaking his huge fist. Has Gorion put more warriors in the fray? Roared Smoit, his face crimson. Then Gast has done the same. Those louts wore his colors. Sire, Taran began, if we can find the cows. Cows? Burst out Smoit. There's more than cows in this, my lad. Such a brawl can spread like a spark through tinder. Those thick-skulled ruffians will set the whole of Cadafor ablaze, and next thing you know, we'll all be at one another's throats. But by my beard, they'll learn my fist smites harder than theirs. Smoit hesitated, and his face darkened with deep concern. He scowled and tugged at his beard. The lords of the next Cantreve, he muttered. They'll not stand idle, but strike against us when they see that we're fighting each other. But the cows, Taran urged. The three of us can seek them while you... The dungeon, cried Smoit. I'll have Gast and Gorion in it before their squabble gets further out of hand. Smoit clapped heels to his horse and charged forward, making no attempt to hold to any pathway, dashing at breakneck speed through bramble and thicket. With the companions and the train of warriors pelting behind, Smoit clattered over the stones of a riverbank and plunged his horse into the swift current. The king had ill chosen his fording place, for in another moment Taran found himself in water up to his saddle horn. Smoit, shouting impatiently, pressed on across the river. Taran saw the king rise up in his stirrups to beckon his followers and urge more haste, but an instant later the war-horse lost footing and lurched sideways. Steed and rider toppled with a mighty splash, and before Taran could spur Melonlas to him, Smoit had been torn loose from his mount, and like a barrel with arms and legs, was being borne quickly downstream. Behind Taran, some of the warriors had turned back, seeking to overtake the king by following along the riverbank. Taran, closer to the opposite bank, urged all strength from Melonlas, leaped from the saddle to dry ground, and raced along the shore after Smoit. The sound of rushing water filled his ears, and with dismay, Taran realized the king was being pulled relentlessly to a waterfall. Heart bursting in his chest, Taran doubled his pace, though before he could set foot in the rapids, he saw the king's red beard sink below the churning water, and he cried out in despair as Smoit vanished over the brink. Chapter 5. A Judgment. Taran scrambled down the rocks jutting beside the high cascade. In a pool hammered into white spray, he could hardly make out Smoit's burly form, spinning in the eddies. Heedless of the pounding water, Taran pitched through the falls and sprang into the pool. He groped for Smoit's belt and seized it at last. Battling the whirlpool, and nearly drowning himself with his own efforts, Taran painfully strove to drag the half-conscious king into the shallows. Smoit was bleeding heavily from the forehead, and his ruddy face had gone chalky pale. Taran tugged at the king's waterlogged bulk, hauling him safely from the rolling waters. In another moment, Gurgi and Fluter were beside him, helping to drag the king ashore. Smoit, like a beached whale, collapsed on the bank. Gurgi, moaning anxiously, loosened the king's garments, while Taran and the bard hastily saw to Smoit's injuries. "He can count himself lucky he's only cracked his skull and half his ribs," Fluter said. "Another man would have been snapped in two, but we're in a fine pickle," he added under his breath to Taran, glancing at the warriors who had come to gather near the unconscious Smoit. "He'll not lay Gast or Gorion by the heels now. He needs more healing than we can give. We'd best take him to Gerkadarn." Taran shook his head. He remembered Smoit's words about the neighboring cantrips who would seize the opportunity to attack. It was in his mind, too, that finding Cornelo would best bring Gast and Gorion to terms, and thus end their battle. But his thoughts were as tangled as Ordu's weaving, and he fervently wished himself in the place of Smoit, whose unconsciousness, at the moment, seemed a most enviable state. "Aiden's farmhold is closer," Taran said. "We'll bring him there, and Gurgi shall stay with him. You and I must seek out Gast and Gorion, and do what we can to stop their quarrel. As for Cornelo and the herd, I doubt we may hope to find them." The companions, tearing their cloaks into strips, set about binding up Smoit's wounds. The king's eyelids fluttered, and he groaned loudly. "Give me to eat," gasped Smoit. "I may be half drowned, but I'll not be half starved." He put a hand on Taran's shoulder. Good lad, you saved my life. Another moment and I'd have been beaten into pudding. Claim any favor, it is yours." "I ask none," Taran replied, knotting the bandages around Smoit's huge chest. "Alas," he murmured, "what I want most, none can grant." "No matter," panted Smoit. "What you wish of me you shall have." "Sire, you cannot travel far," Taran began as Smoit tried painfully to climb to his feet. "Give us leave to ride with your warriors, and—" "Kind master, here!" Gurgi called excitedly. "Here with listenings!" Lion, too, had caught some sound, for her ears cupped forward and her whiskers twitched. "It's my gizzard calling for meat and drink," cried Smoit. "Loud it must be, for I'm empty as a drum." "No, no!" shouted Gurgi, seizing Taran's arms and drawing him past the trees along the riverside. "Gurgi hears no thrummings and drummings, but mooings and cooings." Leaning on the bard, Smoit stumbled after them. Gurgi had spoken the truth. The creature's sharp ears had not deceived him. Now Taran himself heard a faint lowing. Gurgi raced toward the sound. Beyond the trees, the land dipped into a shady dell, watered by a streamlet. Taran cried aloud. There stood the herd, grazing calmly around Cornelo. "My pulse!" bellowed Smoit, so loudly that a dozen horned heads turned and stared as alarmed as if some strange new kind of bull had burst into their quiet pasture. "Great Pelin!" cried Fluter. "Cornelo's led them all to safety. She's wiser than either of her masters." Cornelo raised her head as Taran hurried to her side. She blew out her breath gently and rolled her eyes in a lack of long-suffering patience. Smoit, heedless of his grievous bruises, clapped his hands triumphantly, and shouted at the top of his voice for his warriors. "Sire, let us drive the herd to Aiden's farm," Taran urged. "Your own herds must be tended better than we've done." "Drive them where you please, lad," answered Smoit. "My body and bones, we have them now. That will fetch Gast and Gorion to my at a gallop." He summoned 2 horsemen, commanding them to bear a message to the cantrip lords. "Tell those 2 troublemakers where I'll await them," cried Smoit, "and tell them each to call truce, for his cows are found." "And Gurgi found them," shouted Gurgi, capering wildly. Yes, yes, bold, clever, sharp-eared Gurgi finds all that is lost. Oh, yes. He flung his arms around himself and seemed close to bursting with pride and delight at his own deed. Oh, bards will sing of clever Gurgi with rantings and chantings. I'm sure they will, old friend, Taran said. You found the herd, but don't forget we still have Gast and Gorion to deal with, and there's only one Cornelo. The cows were at first reluctant to quit the dell, but after much coaxing, Taran was able to lead Cornelo along the valley pathways towards Aiden's farm. The others followed her, lowing and tossing their horns. It was a strange procession that wended its way across the meadows and rolling hillocks. Smoit's warriors rode on either side of the herd, and the red-bearded king himself brandished a spear as if it were a drover's staff. Lion padded after the cattle, alert for strays, and Gurgi perched proud as a shaggy rooster on Cornelo's back. When Aiden's hut came in sight, Taran galloped ahead, calling to the farmer. He had no sooner dismounted when the door burst open and he fell back surprised. Aiden stood with a rusted sword in his hand. Behind the farmer, Taran glimpsed Alarka weeping into her apron. Is this how you repay kindness? Aiden cried, recognizing Taran immediately. His eyes blazed as he pointed the ancient weapon at the approaching warband. Do you come with them to spoil our land? Begone, it is done already. How then? Taran stammered, shocked at these words from one he held to be a friend. I ride with King Smoit and his men. We seek peace between Gast and Gorion. Does it matter whose warriors trampled my crops? Aiden flung back. What Gast has destroyed, Gorion has destroyed doubly. Warring back and forth across my field till not a blade of wheat stands. Battle is their pride, but my farm is my life. Do they seek vengeance? I sought only a harvest. In the weariness of despair, Aiden bowed his head and cast his sword to the ground. Taran stared in dismay at the field where Aiden had so painfully labored. The hooves of steeds had churned the earth to mud, uprooting the young shoots which now lay torn to shreds. The harvest on which Aiden had staked his livelihood would never come, and Taran felt the farmer's heart break as if it were his own. Before he could speak, a troop of horsemen galloped from the woods edging the farm. Taran recognized Lord Gorion at their head. In another moment, Lord Gast and his riders appeared. Catching sight of his rival, the Cantref Lord spurred his mount and galloped frantically to the cottage, flung himself out of the saddle, and with a furious shout raced towards Gorion. Robber! Cried Gast. Do you mean to steal Cornelo from me again? Thief! Cried Gorion. I took what was mine to begin with. Liar! Roared Gast. Never was she yours. Insults! Insolence! Roared Gorion, his face turning purple, his hand snatching for his sword. Be silent! Bellowed Smoit. He shook his battle-axe at the Cantref Lords. Your king speaks. How dare you quarrel and insult each other, you pig-headed brawlers! Smoit gestured to his warriors, who strode to seize Gast and Gorion. The riders of the two warbands cried out angrily and made to unsheathe their swords. For an instant, Taran feared another battle would rage there and then, but Smoit's warriors stood their ground, and the sight of the enraged king himself caused the horsemen to draw back submissively. My dungeon will teach you two to be good neighbors, cried Smoit. You'll stay there till you learn. As for Cornelo, I have split my skull, cracked my bones, and ridden to the edge of starvation this day, and so I claim her for myself, a prize of war. And small recompense it is for the vexation you've given me. Another day, and you'd have set the whole Cantref ablaze. At this, Gast and Gorion both roared in furious protest, and Taran could no longer hold his tongue. He strode to the king's side. Sire, even a lifetime in the dungeon will not raise one grate of wheat on a ruined field. Aiden has lost all he hoped to gain, one harvest to keep himself and his wife alive. You offered me a favor, Taran went on. I refused it then. Will you let me claim it now? Ask what you please, my lad, replied Smoit. It is already given. Taran hesitated a moment as he stepped forward and stood facing the Cantref Lords. Then he turned to Smoit. I ask you this, he said. Set Gast and Gorion free. While Smoit blinked in astonishment, Gorion, glimpsing Taran for the first time, exclaimed, It's the pig-keeper who cozened me out of my horse. I took him for a lout, but he asks a noble favor. Grant it, Smoit. He speaks wisdom. Set them free, Taran continued, to labor beside Aiden and strive to mend what they have destroyed. What? Cried Gast. I took him for a hero, but he's no more than a lout. How dare he ask Gast the generous to delve the ground like a mole for no reward? Insults! Impudence! Impertinence! Shouted Gorion. I'll have no pigkeeper pass judgment on Gorion the Valorous. Nor on Gast the Generous! Exclaimed Gast. Pass judgment on yourselves, then, Taran answered, picking up 2 handfuls of earth and torn shoots and holding them before the furious cantrip lords. This is what remains of Aiden's livelihood. As well take a sword and slay him. Look on this, Lord Gorion, for there is more truth here than in your tales of giants and monsters. And this he treasured, Lord Gast, more than you treasure any of your possessions, and it was more truly his own, for he toiled to make it so. Gast and Gorion had fallen silent. The 2 rough Cantrev lords stared at the ground like sheepish boys. Aiden and his wife looked on without speaking. The lad has a better head on his shoulders than I do, exclaimed Smoit, and his judgment is wiser. Kinder, too, for my choice would have been the dungeon, not the delving. The Cantrev lords reluctantly nodded agreement. Taran turned to Smoit. The rest of my favor is this. Grant most where need is greatest. Do you claim Cornelo for your own? Sire, give her to Aiden. Give up Cornelo? Smoit began, sputtering and choking. My prize of war. He finally nodded his head. So be it, lad. Aiden shall keep her, Taran went on, and Gast and Gorion shall have her next calves. What of my herd? Cried Gorion. And mine, cried Gast. They're so mixed together no man can tell his own from another's. Lord Gorion shall divide the herds in equal portions, Taran said. He shall not, Lord Gast broke in. He'll give me all the scrawny ones and keep the fat for himself. It is I who will divide them. Not so, shouted Gorion. You'll fob off none of your raw-boned creatures on me. Lord Gorion shall divide the herds, Taran repeated, but Lord Gast shall be first to choose his half. Well said, Smoit burst out, roaring with laughter. My breath and blood, you have them there. Gorion divides and Gast chooses. Oh, it takes 2 thieves to strike an honest bargain. Aiden and Alarka had come to stand before Taran and King Smoit. Who you may be, I do not know, the farmer said to Taran, but you have befriended me far better than I befriended you. Ah, wisdom of kindly master, cried Gurgi as the Cantrev lords set about dividing their herds, and Smoit's warriors made ready to return to Caircadarn. Gurgi finds cows, but only wise master knows what to do with them. If indeed I did rightly, Taran replied. Gast and Gorion will be waiting for Cornelo's calves. Gast said that they were always twins. I only hope, he added with a grin, that she does not disappoint us. It was long after nightfall when the companions at last reached Caircadarn. Gurgi and Fluter were too exhausted to do more than fling themselves onto their couches. Taran would gladly have followed them, but Smoit took his arm and drew him to the great hall. Count your day well spent, my lad, cried Smoit. You've spared the Cantrev from a war, and me from being drubbed into jelly. As for Gast and Gorion, how long they'll stay at peace with each other, I'll not guess. But you've taught me one thing. My dungeons are useless. My body and bones, I'll have them walled up directly. From this day on, I'll try my hand at speaking instead of smiting. And yet, lad, Smoit went on, furrowing his brow, my wits are slow, but I need no man to tell me that, and I am easier in my mind when I have a blade in my hand. Will you return favor for favor? Stay with me in Cantrev Cataphor. Sire, Taran answered, I seek to learn who my kinsmen are. I cannot... Kinsmen, shouted Smoit, slapping his great girth. There's enough of me to make all the kinsmen you could want. Hear me well, he added in a voice quieter. A widower am I, and childless. Do you yearn for parents? No less do I yearn for a son. When the horn of Gwyn the hunter sounds for me, there shall be none to take my place, and none would I choose but you. Stay, lad, and you shall one day be king of Cataphor. King of Cataphor, Taran cried. His heart leapt. What need to seek the mirror when he could offer Elenwe a royal throne, the proudest gift he could ever lay at her feet? Taran, king of Cataphor. The words rang more sweetly in his ears than Taran assistant pigkeeper. Yet suddenly his joy turned cold. While Elodie might honor his rank, could she respect him for abandoning his quest, even before it had begun? Could he respect himself? For a long while, Taran did not answer. Then with fond admiration he turned his eyes to Smite. "The honor you would give me," Taran began. "There is nothing I would value more highly. Yes, I long to accept it." His voice faltered. "Yet I would rather hold kingship by right of noble birth, not as a gift. It may be," he went on slowly, "that in truth I am nobly born. If it should prove thus, then gladly would I rule Catafor." "How then?" cried Smite. "My body and bones, I'd rather see a wise pig-keeper on my throne than a bloody prince who's a fool." "But there is this as well," Taran answered. "It is in my heart to learn the truth about myself. I will not stop short of it. Were I to do so, who I truly am would forever be unknown, and through all my life I would feel a part of me lacking." At these words, Smite's battle-scarred face fell with sadness, and regretfully he bowed his head. But after a moment he clapped Taran heartily on the back. "My breath, blood, and beard!" he cried. "You've a will to chase the wild goose, will-o'-the-wisp, looking-glass, or whatever it may be. I'll say no more to keep you from it. Seek it out, lad. Whether or not you find it, come back and Catafor will welcome you. But hasten, for if Gast and Gorion are ever at loggerheads again, I'll not vouch for how much of the cantrev will be left." Thus, Taran, with Gurgi and Fluter Flam, set out once more. In his secret heart, Taran cherished the hope he might return to Smite's realm with proud tidings of his parentage. Yet he did not foresee how long it would be until he set foot in Cantrev Catafor again. This concludes Chapter 5. Thank you for listening, and remember, have a good day. You deserve it.